He looked like just another old man. Stooped shoulders, weathered hands, and boots that had seen too many winters. His jacket, army issue from another lifetime, hung loose over a frame that once lifted broken engines and wounded soldiers alike. Most people passed him by without a second glance. No one saw the 3 tours, the Bronze Stars, the nights he stayed awake so others could sleep. They just saw Walter Briggs, 84, slow, silent, alone. But on that cold morning, when a simple accident met cruelty and a slap sent him crumpling to the pavement with a loaf of bread in his hand, something else stirred. Not rage, not revenge, something deeper. Because Walter wasn't just someone's grandfather, he was someone's father. And his name still meant something to the kind of men who moved like shadows and answered only to honor. This story isn't about a punch thrown. It's about a man who never asked for thanks, finally being seen, not for what he lost with age, but for everything he gave before it. And when the ground began to shake and a Blackhawk broke through the clouds, it wasn't for vengeance. It was for respect. Long overdue. He didn't even hit the motorcycle, just brushed a handlebar, barely nudging it as he passed the line of parked bikes, a harmless graze, nothing more. But the biker didn't see an accident. He saw an old man in a worn-out army jacket, and in his mind, that alone was justification enough. There was no warning, no words, just one sudden, brutal crack. And then the old man crumpled to the ground, all 84 years of him folding at the knees like an empty uniform collapsing in slow motion. He didn't drop the paper bag he held, not right away. His hand kept gripping it, even as his body struck the concrete. A loaf of bread and a handful of cough drops spilled from the torn paper, bouncing and rolling toward the gutter. The people outside the bar didn't do a thing. Not one. They just watched. Phones stayed in pockets, eyes flicked, then looked away. A few heads turned, a couple froze mid-sip, but no one moved. No one said a word. They just let it happen. 30 minutes passed. The silence held like a spell no one dared break. And then, something changed. A deep, low thunder rolled across the sky, not from weather, but from something mechanical, deliberate. A vibration in the clouds, growing stronger, faster. The air itself began to pulse. A Blackhawk helicopter, slicing through the sky like a knife, descended with force and purpose, its blades chopping the silence above Main Street into pieces. It landed like a storm dropping from the heavens. And out came the soldiers. They didn't shout. They didn't hesitate. Tactical gear, precision boots, movements rehearsed and flawless. The street felt the shift instantly. Because that man, lying on the pavement in a faded green jacket, was not just an old man. He was someone's father, and someone's unit had been watching. Most people passed Walter Briggs every day without even noticing. Just an old guy in scuffed boots and a tired gait, making the same slow walk down the same sidewalk outside the same bar. Every Thursday for 12 long years. No fanfare, no noise, no one asking who he was. But he had lived through more than most could imagine. A retired army mechanic, Walter had done 3 combat tours, Gulf War, Kosovo, and a mission that still showed up in his dreams. He'd earned 2 commendations, 3 Bronze Stars, and carried 1 Purple Heart in a box he never opened. He never boasted, never expected honor, pity, or even attention. All he ever wanted was a quiet booth in the corner of the diner, a hot coffee, and a slow walk back home with the help of his cane. That morning had been colder than usual. His breath hung in front of him like balm as he stepped out of the small corner deli, a thin paper bag tucked beneath his arm. Inside, a loaf of rye bread, a sleeve of cough drops, and a simple postcard he had meant to send to his grandson at the military academy. He'd chosen the card with care, an old lighthouse on a rocky coast. Across the street, a group of bikers laughed loudly outside the bar. Their bikes gleamed like trophies, chrome polished to perfection. The noise didn't bother Walter. It never had. He had heard far worse in far worse places. Noise didn't scare him. It was silence that once meant danger. He walked slowly, his worn olive green army jacket rustling as he passed. Issued back in 1980, it had seen better days. The sleeves were patched, the lining frayed. But it was still warm, still his. On the left chest was the faint outline of a name tag, W.B. Briggs, barely legible now, faded with time and wear. As he moved along the line of motorcycles, his jacket caught the edge of one of the handlebars. It didn't tip the bike, didn't even shake it much, just rocked it lightly on its stand. Walter stopped immediately, turned to face the group, palms raised in apology. "Didn't mean to touch it, son," he said, his voice calm, edged with humility. "My jacket's thicker than I thought." He even offered a soft smile, genuine, not mocking. He was kind, not careless, just old, just decent. But the tallest biker stepped forward, sunglasses catching the noon sun like a mirror. He didn't ask questions, didn't even glance at the motorcycle. He didn't need an excuse. He just struck. His open hand crashed across Walter's face in a vicious slap, the sound sharp and cruel. It echoed against the brick buildings and left the old man sprawled on the sidewalk. His body hit the concrete with a dull grunt. The paper bag tore open beneath him. The bread spilled into the gutter. Still, no one moved. Someone at the bar chuckled. Another took a slow sip of their drink and turned their chair back toward the sun. Walter didn't scream. He didn't cry out. He sat up slowly, carefully, with trembling hands and a knee that wouldn't quite cooperate. His face flushed, more with humiliation than pain. He began to gather the scattered loaf, now dirtied with dust, oil, and the grime of the street. With slow, precise care, he placed each piece back into the torn bag, as though the bread still mattered. People kept walking. A couple on the sidewalk crossed the street, choosing to pretend they hadn't seen. In the diner window, a waitress looked up from her table and then quickly looked away. The biker who hit him had already turned back to his group, laughing again, louder this time. No apology, no remorse, just confidence, the unshakable belief that he could hit an old man in broad daylight and no one would dare stop him. Walter rose with effort, using a rusted metal pole beside the bus bench for support. His cane had rolled several feet away. He limped to get it, each step heavier than the last, his body groaning beneath the quiet shame of being ignored. He retrieved the cane, eased himself onto the bench, and exhaled slowly. The cold air bit at his lungs. His hearing aid whined softly in one ear. But louder than that was the sound of pride trying not to break. Once in 1970, he'd dragged 3 soldiers out of the flaming Jeep outside Hughes City under enemy fire. Now, in 2025, he couldn't get a stranger to hand him a napkin to wipe the blood from the corner of his mouth. A teenage boy walked by, earbuds in, eyes on his phone. Walter lifted his hand, just slightly, but the boy didn't notice, or didn't want to. He wasn't looking for pity, he just wanted proof that he still existed. Inside the bar, the biker lit a cigarette, grinning. "Old man should have watched where he was going," he said, puffing smoke. "Damn, Grandpa walked right into it." Walter's jaw clenched, but still, he said nothing. He had been called many things in his life: soldier, sergeant, husband, dad. But worthless? That had never been one of them. Quietly, he adjusted his coat, wiped the corner of his lip with his sleeve, and reached into his pocket. From it, he pulled a phone, nothing fancy, just a scratched screen and a few worn buttons. One contact sat at the top of the list, marked plainly, Eagle 6, emergency only. He tapped it once, then leaned back on the bench and waited. 15 minutes passed. He didn't move, didn't pace, didn't fidget. He simply sat upright, eyes ahead, as if waiting for a bus only he knew was coming. Then the sound began, a low, distant thrum. It started as a vibration beneath the concrete, a rhythm buried in the earth. Someone stepped outside the bar, frowning at the sky. A woman looked up from her shopping bags. The sound grew louder, steadier. Glasses on the diner tables began to rattle. "That's not a truck," someone muttered. And they were right. From behind the tree line, slicing through the sky like a steel-winged phantom, came the unmistakable form of a Blackhawk helicopter. Low, fast, relentless. Phones snapped up. Cars slowed. Shoppers froze. Dog barked at the rising thunder. 60 seconds later, the Blackhawk landed in the field behind the row of shops. At the same moment, a black SUV roared down the other end of Main Street and screeched to a stop right outside the bar. Its doors flew open. Boots hit pavement. Not a word was spoken. A dozen figures in full tactical gear moved with perfect synchronicity. Their eyes scanned the area. Every gesture spoke of training, readiness, and restraint. This wasn't a drill. It was a message. From the helicopter, one man stepped down. He didn't wear sunglasses. He didn't strut. But command rolled off him like heat off sun-baked asphalt. He looked mid-50s, built like a fortress, jaw tight, eyes sharp as glass. He didn't glance at the crowd. He walked straight to the bench. Walter looked up. They locked eyes. The old man gave a single, slow nod. The man didn't salute. He knelt. "Dad," he said, gently brushing the dried blood from Walter's cheek. "I got here as fast as I could." Walter didn't speak. He didn't have to, because just then, the biker, still laughing, still smug, began to feel something around him change. The silence had come back, but this time it belonged to someone else. He saw the soldiers, saw the insignia stitched onto the lead man's shoulder. U.S. Army Special Operations. That was the moment everything shifted. The biker's smirk vanished as if someone had wiped it from his face. He just realized who he had slapped. And it was too late to take it back. The street fell utterly silent. Not the kind of silence that comes with peace, but the heavy, suffocating kind that drops right before consequences arrive. The biker stood frozen where he was, the creak of his leather vest the only sound as his posture stiffened. His arrogance drained away so fast, it was like heat lifting from pavement after rain. Commander Briggs didn't rush to his feet. He rose slowly with intention, power in every movement. His hands stayed by his sides. No weapon, no clenched fists. He didn't need them. His presence was enough. Behind him, the rest of his unit fanned out wordlessly, spreading across the street in a smooth arc that closed off the block without a word, like a curtain of quiet force. There were no visible weapons, but the weight of their arrival made everyone's spine straighten without realizing it. Walter Briggs remained seated on the bench, cane still resting under his hands. He lowered his head, not in defeat, not even close, but in quiet recognition. A moment between soldiers. A lifetime behind that one brief bow. Inside the bar, the music had stopped completely. Someone was peeking through the blinds, barely breathing. Behind the counter, the waitress had ducked down, forgotten phone still clutched in her hand. The air was thick, electric. The biker took a step back as Commander Briggs advanced. His voice was low, but it cut through the space like a razor. "Which one of you struck a veteran?" No one answered, not at first. Then, hesitantly, the biker lifted his arms halfway, as if shielding himself from something unseen. "Man, it was just some old guy," he muttered, shrugging like it meant something. "He bumped my ride." Briggs didn't blink, didn't so much as twitch. "That old man," he said, every word solid as stone, "served this country while you were still learning how to spell your own name." A ripple moved through the small crowd that had gathered. Someone quietly said, "Oh, damn," their phone still recording. The biker tried to puff himself back up, voice sharper with false confidence. "You military types think you can just roll in like you own the place." Briggs stepped forward again. Just one step. But that single move sliced through the space between warning and reckoning. "I didn't come here to threaten anyone," he said, calm and cold like a trigger half pulled. "I came because my father bled on this sidewalk. Who cowards stood around and laughed." He turned slightly and raised a single finger. One of his men gave a sharp nod and stepped back, murmuring into the radio clipped to his vest. They didn't need backup, but something bigger was coming. Exactly 2 minutes later, a police cruiser arrived. No sirens, no flashing lights, just the eerie hum of the engine and the quiet crunch of tires on asphalt. This time, the officers weren't indifferent. They looked alert, careful. Briggs didn't need to explain a thing. He simply pointed at the biker. That was enough. The officers moved in and the cuffs clicked shut, not with rage or violence, but a kind of quiet finality. The biker didn't resist, didn't argue. As those cuffs closed around his wrists, whatever confidence he had left melted like ink in the rain. And just like that, it was over. As they led him to the cruiser, the street stayed hushed. Doors creaked open. Faces appeared in windows. People stepped outside slowly, like they were waking from a trance. No one spoke. Walter was still seated on the bench, hands resting on the handle of his cane, his face unreadable, a statue of patience. Commander Briggs returned to him, crouching down until they were eye to eye again. "You okay?" he asked, voice softened now. Walter gave a slow, faint nod. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "I've had worse," he said, but then added in a quieter voice that hung in the air. "Just never in front of so many people who did nothing." That sentence settled over everyone like dust. No one moved for a moment. Then from the edge of the crowd, a woman with gray-streaked hair stepped forward. Her eyes were downcast. She walked slowly, deliberately, and stopped in front of Walter. She held out a folded handkerchief with trembling hands. "I should have said something," she whispered. "I'm sorry." Walter accepted the handkerchief gently, nodded, and then something shifted. A young man near the cafe removed his baseball cap. A father nearby picked up his child and lifted them onto his shoulders, whispering something in the boy's ear. A 10-year-old kid stood tall, chin up, and gave a clumsy but honest salute. The air began to move again. Slowly, subtly. Phones were lowered, hands were extended. No one cheered, no one clapped. The moment wasn't about spectacle. It was about something deeper, something overdue. Respect. An older man, chest rising beneath a weathered flannel shirt, stepped forward and stood at attention. A retired sailor, Another joined him, a former Air Force man, and then more. They lined up beside Walter, shoulder to shoulder, a row of veterans who had been invisible until now. Commander Briggs took a step back, letting the moment unfold without interference. His unit remained still, knowing instinctively that this wasn't their time. It was Walter's, a man who had never asked for applause, who had never expected thanks, but now, finally, was receiving both. Walter sat taller in his seat, not out of pride, but from a burden that had been lifted, something heavy he had carried for years without complaint. Now it was gone. This wasn't about a slap anymore. It was about every time he had been dismissed, ignored, underestimated, and now, finally, seen. By that evening, the video had already started making the rounds online. No music, no flashy cuts, just raw, unedited footage. The slap, the silence, the Blackhawk, the arrest. It didn't need dramatization. It didn't need words. The caption that spread with it said, "Respect the elder. Walter Briggs. Quiet strength." Local news picked it up within hours. By morning, it was on every national outlet. But they didn't just report the incident. They told Walter's story. Sergeant Walter Briggs, U.S. Army mechanic, Gulf War, Kosovo, 3 Bronze Stars, 1 Purple Heart, and until the day before, a man almost no one noticed. The bar issued a weak statement. "Unfortunate incident, not representative of our values." But the public remembered the laughter, the apathy, the doors that stayed shut, and they weren't forgiving it. The mayor personally called Commander Briggs, asked if the town could honor his father with a public event. Briggs replied simply, "If it's for him, not for cameras, he'll come." 1 week later, the town green was transformed. A stage had been set up. Rows of folding chairs spread across the lawn. The local middle school chorus rehearsed the national anthem under the late afternoon sun. This time, Walter arrived in a wheelchair. Not because he was weak, but because someone had finally offered to push him, and he had let them. The moment he arrived, the crowd rose to their feet. Not out of politeness, but something far deeper. A recognition that when dignity is restored, it becomes contagious. The mayor read from a script, said all the right things, but no one really remembered that. What stayed in their minds was the voice of Walter's son. Commander Briggs stood at the microphone. He paused for a long time before speaking. "My father never raised his voice. He didn't strike back. He didn't have to. His life spoke louder than fists ever could." He turned toward Walter, his eyes shining with emotion. "You taught me what strength looks like, and now the world knows it too." Then he stepped down. Walter didn't speak. He didn't have to. He lifted one hand in a slow, deliberate wave, a gesture of acknowledgement, of quiet gratitude. The ovation lasted nearly 4 minutes. Not for medals, not for vengeance, but for every silent sacrifice no one had ever clapped for. Until now. A few days later, an envelope arrived, no return address. The handwriting was shaky. Inside was a short note. "If you'll meet me, I'll listen." It was from the biker. Walter didn't respond right away. He didn't have to. He had every right to ignore it, and no one would have blamed him if he did. The letter had been written with uneven strokes, the ink bleeding slightly at the edges, like the hands that held the pen weren't steady. Maybe from regret, maybe from too many years carrying weight too heavy to put into words. Walter stared at it for a long time. Something in that messy scrawl tugged at an old memory, one that never quite left. Another man from his past came to mind, one he'd served with. Another soul cracked open by war. Haunted, bitter, but not beyond saving. He asked his son to arrange a meeting. Just a brief one. No press, no eyes, no ranks. Before the court hearing. The room was plain, quiet, stripped of ceremony. No uniforms, no flags. Just two chairs at a table. The man who had once struck him sat hunched forward, his bravado gone. The leather vest replaced by a wrinkled button-down. His hands were clenched tight, resting against each other on the table like he was waiting for a hit, not a conversation. Walter entered slowly. He didn't speak at first. He just sat down across from the man, his posture calm, his presence still and composed in that way only a lifetime of discipline can teach you. The silence wasn't awkward. It was deliberate, a pause that made the room hold its breath. "I didn't know who you were," the man muttered eventually, eyes low. "That's the problem," Walter said, his voice soft but anchored. "You didn't care." The man's throat bobbed as he swallowed hard. His gaze darted before landing reluctantly on Walter's eyes. "My dad was a soldier too," he said, the words cracking around the edges. "Vietnam. Came back. Different. Shattered. I spent most of my life angry at the uniform. Thought it stole him from me." Walter nodded, slow and thoughtful. "I knew men like that. Brought home nothing but silence and ghosts. Lost just as much as they ever carried." He didn't preach, didn't raise his voice or lay down judgment. Just sat in that quiet room, letting truth fill the space where pride once stood tall. There was no gavel, no punishment, no fiery confrontation. Just a reckoning. A reckoning that didn't need noise to be powerful. The man, Kyle, wiped at his face with a rough hand, then reached into his coat and slid a folded paper across the table. "Therapy, starting this week. Judge didn't force it. I signed up myself. Volunteering at the VA too. Figured, maybe it's time I start giving something back." Walter picked up the paper, reading it carefully. Then he looked at Kyle, not as a threat, not as a disgrace, but as a man trying to come back from the edge. He placed a hand, aged and worn by time, over Kyle's clenched knuckles. "You won't earn it overnight," Walter said, steady. "But every day you show up, you get a little closer." Kyle nodded. The tears came freely then, and he didn't bother hiding them. That meeting wasn't broadcast. No headlines, no cameras. But it shifted something. Two lives, both carrying invisible weight, found a little more room to breathe in that small, undecorated courthouse room. 6 months later, the corner of Broad Street and Ellison Avenue looked different. Where before there had been blank concrete and silence, now stood a bronze plaque mounted on a polished stone wall. It bore a simple inscription, "In honor of Sergeant Walter Briggs, a quiet shield between us and chaos." Below that, etched deeper than the rest, a single line whispered louder than any anthem. He never asked to be seen. He simply stood. People stopped now. Not everyone, not always, but enough. Enough to matter. On Veterans Day, students left paper flowers there. A mural bloomed across the side of the community center nearby, Walter's silhouette joining others, firefighters, teachers, nurses, each a quiet hero. The artist who painted it never met Walter, but said she'd heard enough to know where he belonged. The city council, without hesitation, voted to rename the patch of green behind the bar where it all happened. They called it Briggs Field. Walter still came by every Thursday. Same boots, same jacket, same deliberate, unhurried stride. But now people saw him. Someone always waved first. A teenager coasting by on a skateboard would Up me head, a new show army recruit, fresh out of basic, would stop and shake his hand. A father would nudge his kid, point toward Walter and whisper, not in awe, but with gentle pride, that's what it looks like to stand for something. And Kyle, the same man who once slammed Walter to the pavement, now drove veterans to and from the VA clinic twice a week in a beat-up Dodge with new tires and cleaned-up seats. He never wore a uniform, but his days started to resemble one. Routine, service, purpose. Walter would catch glimpses of him at the diner, helping a frail vet into a booth, or at the grocery store, carrying a neighbor's bags. No fanfare, no speeches, just a nod when they saw each other, small, solemn, and full of meaning. Two men who once stood on opposite sides of pain, now walking the same direction down the road. Not friends, not enemies, just warriors with different wounds, healing in parallel. Commander Briggs came back only once after the town's tribute ceremony. He and his father sat on the same bench near the plaque. They didn't speak much. They didn't need to. After a while, the commander turned to his father and said quietly, "You taught them something, Dad. You changed this place." Walter watched a boy nearby tie a small flag to the handlebars of his bicycle. His smile was faint, thoughtful. "Maybe," he said, "or maybe they just remembered what mattered." That night, as the wind passed through the trees outside the bar, it sounded almost like helicopter rotors in the distance. Not real, that's all, not this time, but the kind you hear in your chest when a memory gets loud. And if you stood still long enough, you could hear it. Not the machines, but the moment a town stood still because one man refused to fall alone.